Stephen King likes chunky boys. And by that, I mean books like this The Stand, It, Wizard and Glass. Some of the longest books that I've ever read were written by Stephen King, but can he write short stories? Today, as part of my journey to the Dark Tower, we're going to be talking about Everything's Eventual, a collection of 14 dark tales, and specifically the Little Sisters of Eluria, where finally I get reunited with my boy Roland of Gilead. So this video is going to be a little bit different than the other book reviews that I've done for Stephen King on my journey to the Dark Tower. Because there's 14 short stories, rather than doing like a deep dive into each one of them individually, I'm just going to rank them from the story that I liked the least to the story that I enjoyed the most. That means that at first, you're probably going to be thinking that I'm complaining a lot about Stephen King, but don't worry, because actually there are a lot of stories from Everything's Eventual that I really enjoyed, but they're going to come later on in the list. And then, like I say, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the Little Sisters of Eluria because, I want to talk about Roland. So let's start with my absolute least favorite story from Everything's Eventual, and that is the death of Jack Hamilton. So, the death of Jack Hamilton is the story of a member of the John Dillinger gang whose gunshot wound becomes gangrenous. Maybe it would have been more interesting to me if I was interested in that era of American history, if I was interested in John Dillinger, but I'm not really. And I also don't know how much of this story was true and how much was fiction. It also seemed to be, and I could be wrong about this, but it seemed to be one of the longer stories in the collection of short stories. It just seemed to go on and on and on, and at no point did I feel interested. So, for those reasons, 14th out of 14. My second least favorite book in Everything's Eventual is In the Death Room. This is the story where an American journalist is being held captive in a South American prison. Honestly, to me, this felt like every cliche of every torture scene I've seen in any movie. It had the foreign guy with a big mustache, smoking a cigarette, giving orders to his henchman, who's showing a selection of tools that he has at his disposal. You've got the innocent American tough guy tied up, I'll never talk. Uh, like I say, the guy's smoking. We have ways of making you talk. It was just like, I don't know, man. I've seen this way too many times for me to be interested at all. Next up in stories that I didn't really enjoy is All That You Love Will Be Carried Away. When I was sitting down and actually deciding on my ranking for, stories that I enjoyed in Everything's Eventual, I actually couldn't remember this one by the title, and I had to really sit there and think, what was this one? And that's not a good sign when you're thinking about which stories did I enjoy. But yeah, this is a story about a guy who's thinking about ending things, and simultaneously he's thinking about releasing a book of funny graffiti that he's seen on the inside of bathroom stalls. It was pretty funny in places, but ultimately quite forgettable. Don't worry, don't worry. Remember, I like a lot of these. These are just the ones I don't like. All right, next one. Lucky Quarter. Ugh. This was actually the last story in the book, which I thought was a shame because you're ending on a bit of a low note. In a book filled with so many short stories that I enjoyed, ending on Lucky Quarter, it was a bit meh. A maid finds a very unsatisfying tip left behind by one of the hotel guests, and it's said to be like a lucky quarter, and she uses it later in the casino to win big, but then ultimately it was all a dream. And but was when she wakes up from the dream, was it really lucky after all, the lesson that she learned? uh the message of the story wasn't lost on me, but I just felt like it was an unsatisfying way to end a collection of short stories. Okay, so let's get into the top 10. Okay, so coming in at number 10 is LT's Theory of Pets, where a wife buys her husband a dog and it ends up hating him, and the husband buys his wife a cat and it ends up hating her, and then in the end, it all culminates with the wife being taken out by a serial killer. This story, I think, is known for adding a little bit of levity to the collection. It's known for its humor. Apparently, Stephen King actually likes to read this one in front of a live audience because it gets some laughs. And it definitely was one of the funniest or one of the funnier stories in the collection. But there is one that was definitely funnier to me, and we're going to be talking about that later when we get to the top 5. But overall, I enjoyed this one. Okay, next up is The Man in the Black Suit. And this is a story about a young boy who goes fishing by himself. He's sitting in the woods. It's a really kind of a spooky, eerie atmosphere. And then a mysterious man approaches him and starts talking to him. And it's later revealed that this man is the devil. I felt like this story was pretty good at building up tension. At first, I was kind of gripped, by this creepy guy alone in the woods with the boy. It was shrouded in ambiguity and mystery. But then at the end, the payoff it wasn't enough for me. With that said, this short story won an O. Henry Award. So, what do I know? Not much. Next up is That Feeling You Can Only Say When It Is in French. I think that's the title. And I know that some people are going to be a little bit disappointed with this ranking because for a lot of people, this is their favorite. This is their number one story in the collection. And I liked it. I did enjoy it. It's definitely got the best title or the most original title out of the collection. This is the one where a wife and her husband are traveling, and then she is struck with a sense of deja vu, and she's kind of trapped in a cycle of events from which she can't escape. And usually, with this kind of mysterious circumstance, this feeling of being trapped, I'd be into this kind of story. But when I was reading it, I don't know about you, but I felt like this would have been a really good episode of Black Mirror. But for me, on the page, the repetition of it didn't work for me. But it would have been a great episode of Black Mirror or The Twilight Zone or something like that, Okay, next up is The Little Sisters of Eluria. We're back with Roland Deschain, Roland of Gilead, the gunslinger. I was really happy to see my boy again. The good thing about this is that immediately after reading it and Everything's Eventual, I went through the graphic novel. I'm not big into graphic novels, honestly. This is one of the first graphic novels that I've ever read, surprisingly. Just never. I think it might be culturally a different thing in America. I know graphic novels and comic books are really popular. A lot of people grew up reading them. I didn't really know anyone growing up that was reading comic books. I'm sure there were people, but it just wasn't one of those things that was very popular when I was growing up in the 90s, and so I missed out on all of that. Another thing that isn't popular in England, by the way, is Dungeons and Dragons. I know maybe a couple of people that were playing it, but since I moved to America, it seems like Dungeons and Dragons, it was like this huge thing, especially in the 80s and so on. But yeah, this was my first graphic novel that I had ever read, or one of the first, and the artwork was really fantastic, It was just, this isn't the way that I picture Roland, honestly. He's a bit younger, I think maybe a bit thinner. I envisioned him being like a bigger guy. But again, this is a prequel to The Gunslinger. So I'm sorry, I'm just looking at all of the artwork, and it was just really creepy, really unsettling in a good way. And also, there are graphic novels in the Dark Tower series that aren't available in just purely written form. So I don't know, maybe I'm gonna have to dive into those as well after I get done with the Dark Tower. Maybe I'll dive into some of the graphic novels uh, that kind of add a little bit of flavor to the world of the Dark Tower. It didn't quite make it into my top five, unfortunately. The story just wasn't strong enough. It didn't feel as though, even though it was obviously set in Midworld and it's about Roland, it didn't feel as though it organically fit into the story of the Dark Tower. I didn't really learn anything new about the Dark Tower. I learned something new about Roland, but ultimately that's what it felt like it was. It felt like it added a little bit more flesh to the bone of uh, Roland's character. I felt like I knew more about Roland's character having read this, and that was enough for me, honestly. Now, when I reread The Gunslinger, I know that I'll be thinking about the slow mutants in a different way. Roland's experienced the slow mutants before, so when he and Jake see them, he's probably thinking to himself, you guys again, you know? He's had previous with the slow mutants, and talking about them, they were represented in a different way to what I had pictured them as well. When I thought of the slow mutants, I was thinking of them as kind of mindless zombies, animalistic. But in the Little Sisters of Eluria, they can speak. I didn't know that they could speak. Not only that, they're strategic in a way and organized. They have a leader, and the leader is making fashion choices. I think he's got a bowler hat. One second. Yeah, look at this guy. Sorry if the lights are shining on the page, but look at him here. He's wearing a bowler hat like a true English gentleman. It also seemed as though there was some crossover between the Little Sisters of Eluria and the Talisman. I think this is happening in the same location that Jack, sorry, I had to remember his name. Sometimes I get Jake and Jack confused. That Jack entered into. This is happening in the territories, I think. It was fun to spend time with Roland again in Roland's world. I wonder how essential this is to the plot, though, of the Dark Tower. Maybe not that essential, but not everything has to be essential. You can just read for fun. Hopefully that's what you're doing most of the time. Okay, we're getting close to the top five now. Next up is Riding the Bullet. This one's interesting because, you could easily read this and say, just look at it on the surface and just say, oh, it's a story about a hitchhiker that gets picked up by a mysterious guy, and then it turns out he was dead the whole time. And I mean, that is a cliched story, but the way in which this was told, I think, made it unique, made it fresh. What's also interesting about this book is that I think when it was first released, Stephen King just wrote it and then released it exclusively as an ebook. And I think he charged like $2.50 for it, and it sold 400,000 copies immediately. This story is about Alan Parker, whose mother has fallen ill, and so Alan is going back to his hometown. He's hitchhiking all the way, and then he, like I say, gets picked up by this guy. He's thinking back to his childhood, his hometown, his mother, what her expectations were, maybe the ways in which he disappointed her and the guilt that he's carrying from that. And that's when the spectre that he's traveling with gives him a choice. The ending definitely subverted my expectations. In a good way. I think the story really looks into the philosophy of the relationship between parents and their children, what they owe to one another, what they want from one another. And now that I'm thinking about it, maybe this story should have been higher in the rankings, but too late now. All right, let's get into the top five. And by the way, now that we're in top five territory, you should just know I loved all of these, and this was really difficult for me to choose. Okay, coming in at number five is Lunch at the Gotham Cafe. I mentioned earlier that there was one book that stood out to me as being the funniest. This was it. Sometimes I'll complain about Stephen King's unique brand of weirdness where things just come out of left field and you kind of think, is that justified? But with this story, I just found it to be so funny. You know, you think the story's about one thing and then just out of nowhere, it's about something completely different. This story is told from the perspective of a narrator who's going through a divorce with a wife that he still loves. And there's a lot of miscommunication, there's a lot of frustration. They decide to meet up in a restaurant and they're taking sly digs at one another. The husband is just constantly taking little stabs at not literally, not yet, taking little stabs at the lawyer. The lawyer is undermining the husband, and the wife is ice cold, and it's really, ugh, you know, it's messy, it's complicated, and it's all taking place inside of this pristine restaurant on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. Listen, I could so clearly picture this setting. You know, I could imagine the hushed voices of everyone in the restaurant, the clinking glasses, the sound of forks just gently tapping against plates, and then that kind of heavy ambience is just broken by the sound of and what follows is this gory, bloody mess, this carnage. I love it when awkward things happen in silence. And this is beyond awkward, you know. This can't be described as awkward. It's horrific. But yeah, that always makes me laugh when everyone's trying to maintain a certain sense of decorum and something very darkly human happens, and everything just after that appears ridiculous by contrast. You know, it's absurd, and it's so absurd that this easily could have been one of the darker Monty Python sketches. You know, it was really funny, really good. I don't even know if it was supposed to be funny. I found it hilarious. I don't know. Maybe there's something wrong with me. So next up, just shy of the top 3, is Autopsy Room 4. And basically, this is the story of a man who wakes up and realizes that he is in an autopsy room. It's told from a first-person perspective, which makes it even more intense. He can't move, he can't communicate, but he is fully alert to everything that is happening. When I was a kid, I heard a story about a person who was under general anesthetic. And again, they couldn't move, they couldn't communicate, but they could feel everything. They could feel every part of an operation. And I just need to tell you, this messed me up as a kid. This really messed me up. I couldn't think about anything else for a week. I was talking to my friends about it all the time. And reading this from a first person perspective, it was like going back into that memory. Every time the doctor picked up a scalpel and was like coming near to not the patient, the what they assume is the corpse, I was just like, get that thing away from me. Just get it away from me. Yeah. This was pretty terrifying. But it was really good. It was really, really, really suspenseful. Next up is Everything's Eventual from Everything's Eventual. I really like this story mostly for its originality. I'd never really read anything with this plot line before or anything similar to it. This is a story about a slacker who finds a job or is offered a job by a mysterious, shady character, and he has a special ability to make people do things by drawing a sigil. And this shady character that hires him does so on behalf of this mysterious company called the Trans Corporation. And it's, it's a pretty easy job, seems like. He's quite well paid for it. He spends most of his time just hanging out in a property that they provide for him. Any food that he wants is just delivered to him. He spends most of his time watching movies. It all seems a bit too good to be true. And so, it probably is. And he genuinely feels at first like he's doing some good in the world. He's getting rid of scumbags. And he has some sort of moral questions about that, but overall, he thinks that he is a force for good. Eventually, he realizes that these people that he's taken out aren't actually scumbags at all. They are people who are forces of good in the world that he assumed that he was. These are people that are going to cure diseases, lead revolutions against corrupt governments, and they are the linchpins of which all of history are going to rest upon, and he is removing them, and he starts to question the intentions of the Trans Corporation, realizing that they're actually not this great heroic company that he thought that they were. And I felt like it was just really a great original idea, and I really enjoyed it. Okay, so the runner-up is 1408. I actually saw this movie years ago, starring John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson, and I remember really enjoying it, but at the time I didn't even know that it was a Stephen King short story. I didn't know it was based on a Stephen King story. I thought the film was good. I thought the short story was better. A writer is spending the night in a haunted hotel room. And again, it's one of those things where you could say, well, that sounds pretty generic. We've probably seen stuff like that before, but it's written in such a unique and richly atmospheric way that I was just glued to it. I especially liked when he arrives at the hotel and the hotel manager brings him into his office and he's practically begging him not to go into this hotel room. And you're kind of questioning at first, is this a song and dance? Is this, part of the show? Because the writer is very skeptical. He stayed in places that were haunted before. And so, he's like, all right, yeah, I appreciate this thing that you're doing, or maybe you do believe it, but I don't believe in that kind of thing, even though he is a horror writer. I really like that scene where, like I say, the manager's talking about the events of the past, of the room, the history of the room, and when he enters it and everything gets crazy. I just, it's told in a concise way where the plot continues to move forward, but also it takes the time it requires to build up the suspense. And I just thought it was really excellent. And speaking of suspense, we have in the number one spot of Everything's Eventual, what to me is the most suspenseful thing that I've ever read from Stephen King, and that is The Road Virus Heads North. So this is the story of a guy that drives past a garage sale and picks up a painting where the artist met a messy end. And it's not long before he starts to realize that the painting seems to be changing in small ways at first, but then later in much more recognizable ways. This one was interesting because a couple of weeks ago I read Rose Madder, and so there was definitely parallels between this and Rose Madder. It's another story about a living painting that can interact with this world. And maybe I think that's part of the connection. Listen, I don't know. Maybe later on I read in The Dark Tower that these paintings are everywhere and creatures are reaching out of paintings, and that's why it's necessary to read Rose Madder in this book. Listen, I really like Stephen King's writing. I love his original characters. I really enjoy his dialogue. He has a lot of really strong assets to his writing. But for me, one thing that I often find is that Stephen King is not very scary to me. Maybe that's because I'm not reading his scariest books. I haven't read The Shining. I've never read The Shining, for example. I've never read Pet Cemetery, which I know is supposed to be really messed up. I've never read that before. So, it's not 100% fair to say that I don't find Stephen King scary when I'm mostly reading The Dark Tower and everything in the multiverse of The Dark Tower. Um, but this story, the road virus heads north, this was scary. Definitely. Just seeing that image of this creep getting closer and closer. He's gaining on you. He's been to this place that you were just in. He's been to this place. He's following your path and he's always getting closer. And then that scene where the guy falls asleep I think he falls asleep in the shower and he wakes up and he hears the rumbling of an engine outside. And he thinks to himself, wait, did I lock the front door? I think I forgot. He hears creaking on the steps. Someone coming upstairs. Man, that was so good. It was just really well told. And it kind of reminded me of back when we were kids and we'd tell each other ghost stories and freak each other out. This freaked me out. It gave me what I call that little boy fear, where you feel like a kid. Oh, he's going to get me. Yeah, it was great. Now, if you wasn't aware, I'm reading these books as a part of my Journey to the Dark Tower video series, where I'm going through all of the multiverse of the Dark Tower for the very first time. There's 23 books in total, and these books were respectively book number 15 and book number 16. And so, guys, we're getting really close. We're getting close to the end. In my next video, I'm going to be reviewing book number 17 of 23, and that is Hearts in Atlantis. Now, this is actually another collection of short stories. I think there's a novella and some short stories. So this, I think, is much more connected to the Dark Tower, at least one of them. And I've been told you can just read Low Men in Yellow Coats, I think it's called. I'm going to read all of it. But in the next review, I'm going to focus heavily on Low Men in Yellow Coats and kind of just talk about the other stories as well a little bit because, we're reading this together, a lot of us. And so if you'd like to see my review of Hearts in Atlantis, then you can click up here. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And yeah, happy reading. Have a good one.